I paraphrase slightly. Heidegger tells us Nietzsche does not primarily gain his insights into being through empirical reflections, but rather through his intuition concerning the metaphysical development of human beings. I go to a statement from section 4 of the second essay in Thoughts Out of Season. Concerning the critical way, the quote-unquote critical way. He must bring the past to the bar of judgment, interrogate it remorselessly, and finally condemn it. So I believe that sums up the essence of all the bird calls and medley of confusion that we're experiencing right now, which is, one could say it's when crisis periods such as the COVID crisis come up, then everything else is allowed to raise itself up at the gate, and lava is allowed to flow out of ears which had previously been stopped up by the monotony of ordinary dealings. He goes on further to say the process. I mean, we're thinking of things such as the remorseless renaming of all things, and the destruction of monuments, and the all these decisions which are made on the basis of what do we want to set up as moral, as the new Plutarch, as it were, the new ethical models for going forward, and that can't possibly be anyone who possibly existed prior to, let's say, right now, because we don't have the right views yet, and everything must be shaved off the face of the earth and replaced by more proper models. So I think if one reads the second part of section 4 of Nietzsche's essay, one sees quite a bit of that in the critical history. He goes on to say, the process is always dangerous, even for life, and the men or the times that serve life in this way, by judging and annihilating the past, are always dangerous to themselves and others. So this is the wonderful metaphysical encapsulation of the core of the essence of our this little moment. Although clearly, from Heidegger's point of view, the evil is nothing to do with it. This is only at best a symptom of the technological essence. Such activities went on at all times in all places, one can say, from the citizen's point of view, from the more Straussian point of view, more grounded in the immediate cogency. All times in all places is somewhat of a vague phrase, and it basically signals recorded history, I would say. It's hard to project that back 70,000 years to the beginning of speech or whatnot. Then you get very abstract to some extent. We don't really know what was going on in those periods, and then we had to build models based on maybe comparing animal societies and so on. I just reviewed what Dugan says in the first session of his ethnology lectures, where he's mentioning the break. It has some bearing on the current essay, and this break between the old ethnologists or anthropologists and the Boas and post-Boas, the break between this certainty that there's sort of an eternal field out of which animals and the sort of, as it were, semi-animals, the primitives, always and eternally gurgle up, and as though tacitly in the background were the idea of the kind of thing called a man that's sitting there in the mind of God eternally. And then out of these there's the development such as is cogently given in the sense of the pre-literate to the literate, the development of civilization, or the culture, culture spelled with a K in the old sense where it's synonymous with civilization, where civilization is not multiple as it is in Toynbee or Spengler or so. But whereas it's the one human culture, although one might remember that of course this idea of the Catholic culture, the universal culture, has often been very narrow and only proposed by a very small part, or a relatively small proportion of human beings, and is there's all kinds of and even within the Catholic tradition, they've often only thought of some small part of what we're now calling the Western tradition. There's two threefold divisions now in this essay. There's the division of the historian mentioned, the historical people, the non-historical people represented by Leopardi, and then the ones who make the break from that and say, even though this is the truth, all this is true, and we can no longer stay with the being equidistant from eternity view, from the everything constantly gurgling up, as still Herder thought. That was also going to mention that there's Dugan deduces all kinds of things that are tangential to what Nietzsche's thinking here. He deduces Herder with the regard of language as being treated now as being somehow in the mind of God, as it were, equidistant to eternity in some sense. That's just a possible interpretation, but also that he gives a quote on his concept of the ethnos in connection to Max Weber, where he says this is a quote-unquote subjective category, where it means not the biological conditions, and not something understood by the science of evolutionary biologists, or let's say by somebody studying DNA or genetics, but rather the subjective belief. So in other words, we have a belief that we're part of a group, and this is the spontaneous support for our whole life. And then I would say this carries over in a more conscious and abstract way once you get into 1848, beyond 1848, where the political in the current sense outstrips the philosophical, in the sense that then we get this no longer the ethnos is just the belief that spontaneously is the support of life, but rather, which is in a contrived, in a conscious way, the support of one's, for instance, juridical citizenship, in such a way that it's constantly a negotiation which is available to one to modify and to rationalize and to propose in different forms of propaganda and different forms of ideology. So the other thing I wanted to get to is that in this sphere, the higgledy-piggledy that I see in it relates to the fact that in general, all these things which always happened are still happening, and here they're not happening with any awareness of Dasein. Even Nietzsche doesn't have the awareness of Dasein, according to Heidegger, but Nietzsche has this awareness of the falling out of the equidistant from eternity, which is not seen at all by people that in one way or another believe that they're progressing, believe that what they're doing is there's a sense of the naivety of all these projects, which then if you look at the specific life histories, for instance, I was thinking of in terms of allow me to give a biography of Judith Butler, which is I don't propose it as an accurate biography, but just as somewhat of an expressionistic proposition. So here you have a young woman who comes into contact with some ideas such as German idealism. She's precocious, she poses to herself the problem of did German idealism contribute to what happened in World War II? She runs into a very well-educated rabbi who reads Erich Auerbach, and who brings her into contact with the high theory and so-called and other things of that nature. She goes on to college to read Aristotle and Plato and so on. Then she through her own personal contacts and from herself, she realizes there's these problems with sexual identity and gender. She thinks here's a collective project that she needs a voice. And so there's a kind of just these things just and the conditions in the university are right for that, coming out of the in the wake of the civil rights movements, in the wake of other things, and with the influx of all the various forces, sociology taking over, in the side of the humanities, let's say. And I mean, remembering that one could say, I should point out very quickly that very little money goes into all these fields, and it's ridiculous the things you hear on Fox News about worrying about the apportionment of money by the universities. 95% of the money goes to basic scientific research and things of that kind. But the problem is then, from the Straussian point of view, there isn't money going into these things. They're just higgledy-piggledy, because they're regarded as simply the talk about agathon, the good, or the kalon, the beautiful and the noble, the true, and all these things that are regarded as simply like the leftovers. The values in toto are like the leftovers of the things Plato were talking about, and it's all just left up to the vicissitudes of individual fates as they come into contact with the university. It's not done in the way that Strauss was trying to reinitiate it, which would be a higher, more disciplined way. One could argue a long way about the details of how disciplined the current university is and so on, but I'm proposing this higgledy-piggledy model as, in essence, what's happening. And it also happens in the case of nation states and their development in this conscious development of calling on rationalizations and so on. In the case of the Ukraine case, for instance. All right, let's go on with that for the next time.